There have been some long-standing questions about remote work on a French visitor visa. Primarily, is it allowed? And if it is, what are your obligations as a resident of France? So finally, last week, France gave us some more written guidance.
Yay for guidance,
Yes.
yeah. Even with these new guidelines, however, there's still a lot of simmering disagreement out there, and people have some very strong feelings about this situation. In this video, we're going to go through France's response to this, line by line, discuss what we know about France's view of remote work on the visitor visa, and what that might mean for you.
Hi, I'm Raina.
I'm Jason.
We are Baguette Bound. We help Americans move, adjust, and enjoy life in France. If you are curious about working with us, you can check out our website.
Okay, so let's start with a little background on the situation first to bring us up to speed.
You haven't been following this.
France has no digital nomad visa. It doesn't exist. There's nothing written like this at all in the French visa lineup. So in the past, if you were a US citizen working remotely as an employee in like a W-2 type employment job for a US employer with no presence in France, and you wanted to continue working at this US job and legally move to France, there just wasn't a French visa that clearly suited this type of employment situation.
Yeah, I mean, you were in this area where you are still working, but you're not self-employed. So the entrepreneur visas, like Professions Liberales Entrepreneur or Entrepreneur Talent Visa, those didn't really work quite right. They didn't work for this situation. And at the same time, the traditionally non-working visitor visa always felt like, you know, an awkward fit because you are technically still working. And in order to get the visitor visa, you have to sign a document attesting you will not practice any professional activity in France. So this left a lot of kind of unsettled.
It felt like a lot of confusion if you were working and signing a document saying you would not practice any professional activity. But what's always been very unclear is exactly how France defined this practice of professional activity.
This is the heart.
What exactly constitutes professional activity in France? What are you signing and declaring when you say you are not going to practice any professional activity in France?
Right.
Are you professionally active if you're living in France, doing any kind of paid work remotely, even if it's not associated with the French economy in any way? Who knows? Or do you have to be more deeply involved in the French economy with French businesses, French customers, French products, etc., in order to qualify as professionally active in France? We just had no idea how to define this term.
Because France had never defined it.
Right.
Yeah. So in practice, we know people have been working remotely in France on a W-2 employment type job and had their visas approved by the French embassy in the US by supplying pay stubs from their remote work job as their proof of funds in France.
Yeah, so it definitely appeared that this must be okay, at least from an immigration standpoint, based on how the embassy had been handling it. But without something written defining what your obligations are in this arrangement, it left many people feeling in a very ambiguous legal and immigration situation, especially around the question of French employment taxes or social contributions. Like, do you still owe these charges if you're actively working remotely for a foreign company while living here in France? Who knows?
Yeah. On June 23rd, 2026, the French Interior Ministry provided a written response to a question posed to it by the legislature. So this response provides greater clarity by defining how remote work relates to the French market, and this makes it easier to figure out what your obligations are, particularly with taxes.
With taxes, sure.
Now, I will now turn over the stage to my lovely husband, who his background, if you didn't know or didn't already figure this out, is in accounting, but specifically regulatory accounting. And he seems to find a lot of satisfaction in unpacking tax and regulatory documents. So
I don't know, that might be too much of a build-up. I'm not sure how much I enjoy this, but okay, let's do this. So in short, this is really great news for those of you who want to work remotely on a visitor visa. This is full of great news, but let's unpack exactly what it says and what it doesn't say, and we'll go line by line to break this down together. Okay, so here in the first part, the first sentence of the response, this just tells us that there's no written legislation covering this issue, which is why the issue has been so confusing and debated in the past. I mean, we already knew this. There's no legislative text to rely on, which is why the Interior Ministry had been asked to address this specific subject in detail. Okay, so this next section is really just another statement of fact. They're telling us that the existing visas for work purposes, things like salaried jobs or professions liberale, entrepreneur visas, talent visas, such like that, these require you to be involved in the French economy in some manner in order to ever qualify for the visa and the residency card. If you're integrated into the French economy, you need a professional visa, not a visitor visa. That's what they're telling us. And there's nothing new here for these other types of visas that they're referencing. And we're really still kind of defining terms before we get to their real response. Okay, so here we go. This next section, section 3, you can read along with me as we're going. So now we've really kind of gotten to the first really interesting aspect of their response, I think. They're finally like breaking new ground here. And at this point, they've really laid out 3 criteria in order to qualify to work on a visitor visa. Now remember in the text here that the renewable visitor visa is also a residency permit. So when the text says residency permit, it also means that visitor visa that you first qualify for when you're coming here.
The renewable one.
Yeah. So the 3 criteria that they've laid out for us for working on a visitor visa. Number 1, not engaging in activity on French territory that is integrated into the French economy. Remember, we just defined that if you're integrated into the French economy, you need one of those professional purpose visas or residency permits. The following section in a moment is going to help us with this criteria, so we'll come back to this topic in a second. So the company that you're working for, if you're working remotely, must have no stable presence in France. You shouldn't be working with French clients on behalf of your company. There should be no footprint, no base of operations, no office or association in any way with the French economy. You kind of need to stand outside of that to qualify for criteria 1. Criteria 2, very simple. You just have to be receiving compensation for work. I mean, this is obvious and shouldn't require any explanation. If you're being paid, you're working. Number 3, the next criteria is kind of the next big one. You must be paying the associated taxes on this earned compensation in your origin country, your home country. This third one is a bit tricky because it involves the tax code and tax regulations. So we'll come back to this one in a second when we've got a little more clarity from the response. Okay. So kind of section 4 here, maybe sentence 4 of this response. This part is really very clear, and it helps us define some of the prior criteria. So it tells us if you're performing remote work for an employer governed under foreign law, you're not working, you're considered inactive under French law. So, I mean, this is the guts of this thing, right?
This is the big change.
A remote work job for a foreign company that has no presence in France is now formally considered not working in the French economy. So now we know.
Yeah.
If you're in this specific situation and you meet these criteria, you're not active, you're not working, you're not involved in the French economy.
Meaning, this was always the big question, right? What are my obligations if I am living in a French territory? Am I part of the French economy and the French labor market, more importantly, by default? And this has been the big thing, right?
Yeah.
That is now defined, that if you're working in this situation, you are not seen as part of the French labor market.
So now we see that
you can still be a tax resident.
We're still compliant if we're working remotely and signing that document that says we will not be professionally active, because France says this is not professionally active in France.
This situation,
right?
Yeah.
So now we know that criteria number 1 that we assigned earlier for working on a visitor visa is met in this case because you're not involved in the French economy. Remember that the definitions that they've given us here is very important. You're not employed in France, you do not carry out professional activities on behalf of a company located in France, and you work remotely for an employer or a business governed by a foreign law. So if you're working remotely, but you meet some of those other criteria, you're working with French clients, you're visiting French sites, your company is here in France too, I would not read this as carte blanche to just come with any type of remote job. You've got to meet all these criteria.
Yeah.
So this, for example, is very clear for employees in like a W-2 type employment situation in the US, where you're an employee of a US company that has no base of operations here in France, no active business activity here in France. The French government is telling you that this will qualify for a visitor visa. So criteria number 1 that we laid out is now super clear. We kind of can check this box, with very thick ink, I guess. And we laid out the other two criteria. Criteria 2 is just being paid. It's easy. Criteria 3 is taxes, the other kind of complicated section of this. So remember, the criteria here was that you're still paying your taxes in your home country on this earned income. France is being, I think, very careful here to make sure that they are not becoming a tax haven, that you can't say, I'm not paying taxes here, I'm not paying taxes here, I'm not paying taxes anywhere, but I've got a visitor visa and I'm legal. No, you got to be paying taxes in your home country in order to qualify and stay compliant on this visa.
Right, likely where the origin of this income and the labor market you're actually working in.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, some people, after seeing this news, this response from the French government that provided a lot of clarity, have still said very loudly over and over that Americans working remotely in France still cannot meet this requirement because they are French tax residents. And while it's true that they're French tax residents, I think they're not connecting all the dots. So these dissenting voices claim that any earned income in France that's received, or any earned income received while you are living in France, so a remote work job while you're living in France, they claim that taxes must be paid in France, not your home country, and they must be paid in France because you are a French tax resident. This is just wrong. This is too simple of a statement, too carte blanche. You can't make that carte blanche statement. So every government, including France, has rules for how to report your foreign income. All of these rules and regulations for each country across the world is going to vary depending on the specific tax rules of each country involved, perhaps specific tax treaties between the two involved countries. So we're focusing a little bit on the United States here. If you're coming from another country with a remote work job, you definitely want to look in more detail into your specific tax situation to make sure you're still able to pay taxes in your home country. Okay, so before this statement, I'm wearing down here.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Before this statement, it was definitely unclear if, as a French resident and you're working on a remote job, were you considered active in the French labor market, or were you active in the other market where your job was maybe originally located, where you were kind of exercising your work rights in? With this response from the Interior Ministry, we have written documentation that remote employment while living in France is not considered part of the French labor market. You're not active in France. You're not exercising activity in France. And this definition provides really good guidance for where the remote workers can expect their tax obligation for their earned income to be.
This was always kind of the big gray area that everyone was a little nervous about.
Where the activity happened is critical.
Right, because you might...
How do you apply taxes?
Yeah, people have always been declaring their worldwide income, right? And just following the instructions, but it was always like, is this the right response based on how France looks at the work?
Yeah.
Now we have that defined.
Yeah, so definitely, some takeaway homework for you. If you're not US based, if you don't have a US based job, you definitely need to do your own investigation into your own tax situation to make sure you're able to still comply with this situation.
We're speaking to the US.
But we'll talk specifically now about the US-France tax treaty for a moment. The US-France tax treaty does have specific language about earned income found in Article 15. To my knowledge, we don't have any specific interpretations about this exact situation from either the US or the French tax treaty. I mean, like remote working in another country. So we're kind of left with our own, or perhaps your accountant's own personal interpretation of the language in this treaty. Article 15 does lay out the specific criteria for where taxes should be paid for the salaries and wages of people who find themselves working across countries. And I think luckily for us here, the language used by France in this response tells us that France does not consider remote workers who meet all these criteria to be actively working or exercising their economic activity in France. And this is key because this language of not exercising your economic activity in the country of France, it gives us a clue as to how to interpret the tax treaty and where taxes should be paid. Your economic activities in the US is what they're saying, or it's not in France at least. So it must be in the other country. Your economic activity is in the other country, and then with that knowledge you can interpret the French tax treaty to tell you where to pay taxes. It would definitely be very nice if we had a more detailed write-up from either the French or the US tax authorities to spell this out a little more clearly. But in the absence of that, we have to go with the information that we have. And I do think it's very clear at this moment.
Yeah.
And it's good news for remote workers.
Right. So you report everything. It's counted as foreign income, and that's what we can go with until we hear otherwise.
Yeah. So all of these things together with the immigration code kind of language and the tax language now that we can apply, it tells us that Americans that are working remotely in a W-2 type of job, employed by an American employer, and they're living in France, can still meet all the criteria that France has laid out in order to qualify for a visitor visa.
Yay!
Yay! Yeah. Okay, so back to the actual response now. Tax deviation aside, back to the actual response.
If you're still with us.
Yeah. Drink some more coffee, wake back up. So here at the end of the response, there isn't a really important note that they kind of tacked on about regulated professions. And regulated professions are still regulated in France. So if you are acting in a role that requires authorization from a regulatory body here in France, it's like doctors, lawyers, chartered accountants, this ruling does not give you kind of a blanket ability to act in a regulated capacity in France, even if you're doing so remotely. So be very aware of that, whether you're regulated or unregulated.
Yeah, and we mentioned this before, but one other caveat to remember with all this is that these guidelines are laid out and really only apply to, speaking again about the U.S., W-2 employment, where you are exercising your U.S. or foreign work rights and have no association with any kind with the French economy. So that means if you are self-employed, an entrepreneur visa is still the compliant option for you. We've seen lots of debate about this the last few days since this guideline came out of people thinking of switching, but that if you're self-employed, you still need the appropriate working visa in France. Now, if you ask ChatGPT this, it will often tell you, oh, just set up an LLC and make yourself an employee, then work that way under the visitor visa. No problem.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, okay. Stop and consider this for a moment. Do not take this at face value. So if a company, a US company, moved its entire leadership team, workforce, business operations to France, I think most people would say they are now located in the French economy, right? Everything to do with this business is happening here. And if they were just registered themselves as a legal entity in some other country, it wouldn't change the fact that the business is located in France, the whole thing. So if you are a one-person business, which, a lot of things like consulting, graphic designer, a lot of things that might come on those self-employment visas, you are the leadership team, the workforce, the business operations unit. So the same applies to you. When you move, you've moved the whole business. You just relocated your entire company to France and therefore should have the appropriate legal authorization and structure to do business here. This does not change that.
So this just doesn't work on the French visitor visa here in France. It doesn't check any of the boxes.
Yeah. The one other caveat to remember here is that while the beauty of this statement from the Interior Ministry was that it helped us define that remote work is, the origin of that work now is looked at as outside of France, that will also mean by not participating in the French economy, your economic means originate outside of France. You've got foreign income. Now, if one of your big goals is to obtain citizenship, this will count against you when you apply, because if you are going to become a citizen of France, particularly the last couple of years, they've really applied this test of your economic interests being centered in France, and so this is not going to help your application.
Yeah, at least at this moment.
At least at this moment, while they're interpreting, right? Yeah. So, and that may not be one of your goals, and so this may not matter. But if it is, you just,
keep that in mind.
Keep that in mind, right? And for other ways that you can sort of arrange remote work, should your company be open to it and actually be considered part of the French economy, you can check out this video that we did talking about methods to set that up with some of the other visas in different ways.
So, overall, personally, I think this is a really great approach for France to take with the visitor visa, because you have someone coming in who isn't taking a French job in the French economy, but they're still spending their salary here. This person may have a lot of flexibility to live in the parts of France that could probably use a little more population. And this would be a great benefit to some of the smaller towns and villages across the country. Yeah,
Come
like
be our
here.
neighbors.
Yeah. So you'll still be able to participate in the public healthcare system, and with recent legislation that was passed earlier this year, people on visitor visas, including those working remotely, will soon be able to make a yearly contribution into the healthcare system, which I think everyone really feels good about,
yeah.
having a method and a manner to be able to do that now.
Yeah.
So
All right.
overall, you can work remotely, you can have a stable immigration status, you can be tax compliant, you can contribute to the French healthcare system, and we hope live out your French dream, however that looks for you.
Yeah. Thanks for watching.
A bientôt.